Hey everyone. This week we're going to have a little departure from Canvas, at least for the lecture video, and we're going to get into another one of the really fundamental topics of programming, and that's arrays. You'll see what it is. It's a way to store multiple values. JavaScript uses arrays in a different way than Java and C++ and some other languages. And so you might notice some differences if you already have good familiarity with arrays in another language. Let's just get into it. So we've been programming and dealing with values, since the beginning. Values have a type, Boolean, string, number, and so you have like a single value at a time. We have variables that we've used to store a value that we want to save or work with in some way. So far, if we want to store 3 values, we need to use 3 variables. So maybe we'd have n1, n2, and n3 for 3 numbers. What if we want to store 100 numbers? We could make 100 variables, but this pretty obviously gets very problematic quickly. So what would we do if we don't know how many we need? Because you could make 100 variables, but what if you don't know if you need 100 or 1,000 or 20? This is where arrays are going to become a great solution. They're great for storing, multiple values, as many as you need, into a single, not value, but sort of a single element, a single object. So when we create an array, we are going to use a variable to refer to the entire array. Each item in the array, sometimes I'll call them items, they're also called elements. There's probably another term that I'm forgetting. I'll probably use elements most often, but item or element I'll use interchangeably. In the array is a value and has an index number. So when we refer to an element in the array, we're going to use the array name and the index number, and we're going to use these square brackets. And so if we have an array called n with length 4, we're going to have indexes 0, 1, 2, and 3, and we can access them in this way. And it's basically like having 4 separate variables to store values. How can we create an array? Well, we can use let, just like usual. And in the first way, we're just going to use kind of square brackets, and we will be allowed to put things in there. But you can create an empty array, which is what this is. That's similar to an empty string. Here we have an array with a single value. And here we have an array with 3 values, 3 strings, and an array with 3 values, a number, a string, and a Boolean. This is one thing that JavaScript allows, is it allows you to have different types of values in the same array. Many languages require an array to have only numbers or only strings or only Booleans. If you're giving it multiple values, you put a comma between each value. No comma at the beginning or end, just the brackets. And so here's kind of a diagram for one of them. For my array 3, it has 3 elements, so 3 locations. Index 0 for the first one, index 1 for the second, index 2 for the third. And so we'll be able to access them using the name and the index. And so this is one way to create an array, directly writing out the values in between the square brackets. We can also create an array using the array method. Notice that array has a capital A here. And so new array, we have to have the new keyword here, new array, and then you say how long you want the array to be. This creates an array of length 5, and the value for each element starts out as undefined. Just like if we created a variable by saying let x, x is initially undefined, that's what we have here. So the array has length 5, it's ready for 5 values, but there aren't any values yet. Now if we want to assign values, we can use the name, the square brackets and an index and give it a value. So we assign apple to my array 0, orange to my array 1, banana to my array 2. At this point, indexes 3 and 4 are still undefined. When you want to access the array values, we just kind of use that same notation, the name and then the index in brackets. And so then we can just use it like a variable, just like we could put x here. If we had a variable x, we can put my array 0 and print it to the console or wherever we want. If we want to modify it, we just use the assignment operator as usual. And so an array is really like a set of variables that are collected together into kind of a single object. I'm trying to avoid the word object, but I can't come up with a better word right now. Object will become an important term later and in a couple of weeks. But for the moment, just it's kind of into one one thing. Sometime as I'm talking through this, I'm going to come up with a better word. So it kind of gives us a way to store multiple values into a single variable. Those values are kind of collected together. A single collection. There we go. Let's go with that. If we want to add new elements to an array, new items to an array, we can use .push. And so this will add a new element to the end of an array. And so if we start it with the array apple, orange, and banana, you push, you put the value that you want to push on, and that's added at the end, in this case at index 3. And this is the way that we will want you to add elements. The only other way I think we'll want you to use is is a way to insert, which we'll see later on. And so if you're not changing the value of an element that already exists, like we could change 0, 1, and 2 directly, but you need an extra element in the array, use push or our tool for inserting later. I'll talk more about this when I kind of play in the console. If you want to remove an item from an array, we can remove an item from the end of an array. And the function that allows us to do this is pop. And so if you start out with this array that we just had, if we call myArray.pop, pair will get removed, and myArray.pop returns that value that's removed. So we're popping it off and assigning it to item here. You don't have to assign it to anything if you're just throwing it away, but you can assign it. And so we're going to use push to add items to the end of the array, pop to remove them from the end of the array. And these functions only work on the end. You can't push something into the middle, you can't pop something from the middle, they only work at the end. You can display arrays in the console, you can just print it directly to the console, you can use array.toString, or there's this console.table. I found there's occasionally problems with this, but this can actually work really well sometimes. Hopefully I'll remember to demo that a little bit more later. And these all work for displaying it, to the web page or in an alert if you're trying to see what's happening with your array. Okay, here's an exercise. And once we're working on this exercise, I'll try a few different things in the console. So how would you write the JavaScript to create an array to store the names of 25 students? You're not filling it with any values yet, but how would you create an array that's ready for 25 values? Write the JavaScript to create an array to store a credit card transaction, and the array should have the following pieces of information. So we have a couple strings and a couple numbers. There's definitely multiple ways that you know how to do this already. So take a minute, see if you can figure this out, and we'll go through a solution. Okay, let's look at how to do this. Yeah, come on, there we go. So I don't think we'll need this. Let's start the first one. Create an array with Size 25, ready for 25 names. Doesn't store anything yet, but it's kind of ready to be accessed. We're going to imagine that this is something that might be used by multiple functions. And so maybe this would be a global. And I'm also going to do this so I have access to it in the console. Just remember, don't make something global unless you have a good reason to. And so we can say let names equals new array 25. That's it. And that's going to create an array. It's going to be ready for 25 values. If I run this code, if I just refresh the page, that global code gets run. Globals that are created, you can just access directly in the console. So if I type in names, it shows us that we have an array of 25. This is the length. If we go further, you can expand this and see that's not quite what we wanted. Once it has values, it gets clear. But this says it has 25. If we say names for anything like that, just undefined. There's nothing there yet. So presumably once you make this, you might have a function, would prompt the user, and add a new name to the array. So let's just display it on the screen. Let's actually very quickly add something here. So let's say we're just going to display the array names. And let's say we're going to just say names 0. We won't worry about prompting. Equals, let's think of names. Tend to think of that one first. Names 1 equals, I don't know, Jane. Names 2 equals John. Stuff like that. So let's run this. And we can see that when this is displayed, we have Chris, Jane, and John. We see all sorts of commas because the array has the length of 25, but doesn't have any values in those locations. And so this is one way that you could add names to the array. More likely when you're filling an array, you're going to have some kind of loop. And let's just do a quick loop here to show something that might happen. Let's say let index equals 0. Just like strings, 0 is the first index. And we'll say while, let's just go up to 5. Index is less than 5. Names I have index here, index equals prompt, enter a name. And when we're done, when the while loop finishes, it'll print out the array. Let's make sure to increment index so we don't have an infinite loop. And so we're going to enter 5 names in the array. It's still going to be mostly empty, but this is a more common way to work with arrays. Arrays and loops, just, if you're working with an array, you're almost always working with a loop. So let's kind of get into that quickly. Run the example. Chris, I don't know, Harshpreet, let's say Judy, let's say Oliver, let's say on, and so we have our first 5 names there in the array. We can still look at it in the console. And so now we can see that it's starting to fill with values, and those are displayed in the console. So there's an array ready for 25 values. We haven't completely filled it, but you could see if we had this while loop repeat enough, we could fill it that way, or there might be other ways to get it filled. All right, let's do this. Let's actually get to the second one here. And let's just create an array for let transaction equal, let's start with the empty array, and then we'll use push here. Transaction dot push Dr. Pepper transaction dot push. It was some number, and you can see you just do this for each of the values. I don't remember, I think this was another number. I'm not going to worry about it too much, but the point is that we were putting 4 pieces of information into the array. And we'll show transaction. Let's click our button, and we can see that we get all the pieces of information there. The first 2 are strings, the second 2 are just numbers. Another way to do this one, also completely correct, is to just do this, and then you could say Dr. Pepper, comma, something, comma, something. If you know all the values that need to go in, that's absolutely fine. In this example, both ways are completely correct. But let's use the console to play with these arrays a little bit and talk about how I want you to work with them and how I don't want you to work with them. Because JavaScript allows you to do things, as it often does, that I don't want you to do. Because I want you to get comfortable with working with an array, paying attention to its length. Because what JavaScript lets you do, so let's say we wanted to make, let's say we just wanted 2 names, or 2 numbers. Let's just say values equals new array 2. And I said values 0 equals 2, values 1 equals 4. So now what's in values? We can look at values. JavaScript apparently has a function called values, which is not helping us out. Let me redo this quickly. Let's go back up to the top. Let's say let vals equals new array 2. Okay. We'll do this. We'll do this. Now we can look at vals. And we can see we have our array with 2 values. So remember, if you just use the name of the array, it's the entire array. If you do vals with the brackets, you need to put a value in there. It's an easy way to make a mistake. I see this constantly. If you're referring to the whole array, you just use the name. If you want one element of the array, use the square brackets, put in the index you're interested in, and that's how you get one element of the array. You're never going to have those brackets and have them empty. Okay, so now we have our array with 2 values, but let's say, oh, I want to add more. This array has length 2. We have dot length the same way we do for a string. So currently it has indexes 0 and 1. Most languages will only let you access those indexes. JavaScript will let you access an index that doesn't exist yet. So let's do 2 equals 6. And now our array has 3 values. I don't want you to do this. I only want you to access an index that already exists. In a lot of languages, this would crash your program immediately. Another thing I really don't want you to do, same idea, but even worse, you can just say values. I was about to do 100, but let's do something a little smaller. Let's say values 10 equals 20. And now we have an array with a whole bunch of empty slots, and then we're going to have our value 20 after that. So index 0 has 2, index 1 has 4, index 2 has 6, index 10 has 20. We have a bunch of indexes that are, again, undefined. And it says the length is 11, so I don't want you ever to do this. Yes, there are ways you can take advantage of this in creative ways, but we're not going to do that. I want you to understand the basic idea of arrays. And normally, JavaScript often does things that aren't normal. Normally, we're just going, an array just has a series of values, no empty spaces. What did I forget? I forgot the equal sign. No empty spaces. Only access indexes that exist and work with indexes that exist. We can do push. And we can see that that got pushed onto the array. Vals.pop removes values from the array. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to kind of play with there. I think I hit the important points. Yeah, I think so. Let me see, and I don't know how well this is going to work with a small array. Console.table vals. And so it just gives you a nicely printed out table of an array. And when we get to 2D arrays, this can be even nicer. So anywhere in your code, you can put in something like console.table, ignore the bad indentation, please. I'll fix it. Always fix your indentation. And now if I click the button, vals. Okay, I'm smart. Let's do transaction. Let's do something that actually exists inside this function. And there we go. And this is a really useful way when you're running your code to see what's happening with one of your arrays. Because oftentimes you're working with an array, you're changing one value, you're changing two values, you're changing three values, and it's easy to lose track of what's happening. So if you're at a point in your code where you want to see what's actually happening with the array, you could just print it out with a console.log, but sometimes this console.table is a nice way to get you have the index here, you get nice formatting for it. Okay, I think we can finally move forward. So as I was mentioning, loops and arrays just work together. You know, if you're working with an array, you're almost certainly working with a loop. And usually with an array, you're working with a for loop, just like where we're using for loops for strings. And so here's an example where we have a for loop working with an array. This is your favorite for loop. As I said before, you do not have a choice. You can see j equals 0, j is less than some nums.length, j++. Just assume that this array some nums has some numbers in it. What is this little piece of code going to do? Pause and take a look at it. What's going to happen to our array if we run this? Okay, let's actually run this code. I think I have this one ready to copy in. Let's copy this. Let's do that. And we'll just display it there. So what's going to be printed out if we have our 2, 4, 5, 6, 4, 2 in the array? Let's try it. 4, 8, 10, 12, 8, 4. It's doubling each value. It's going through the array one element at a time. J starts at 0 for the first element, and assigning it a new value, which is its current value times 2. So this is kind of like x equals x times 2, except we're using the values in an array. So we're using a loop to do something for each element in an array. We've talked about it already. There are a couple little questions at the bottom of the slide. What is the length? That just tells you how many elements are in the array. But the second one is, why do we have less than instead of less than equal to here? Well, the first index is 0. If the length is 6 like it is here, The last index is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so we don't want to include 6 as an index when we work through the array. Let's see what happens when we run this with 6. And we're getting nothing. And there we go. Why are we getting nothing? This is fun times with JavaScript because of what happens when you access an index that doesn't exist. Let's actually do this in the console. Let's say let vals equal 1, 2. Let's just make it 2 values, so its length is 2. Well, what's happening in our loop is that we're trying to use the length as an index, right? So if the length was 6, we try to access index 6. Well, let's do that here, except we'll use index 2 because that's the length. What does vals 2 give us? Undefined. Well, because that doesn't cause an error, we can say vals 2 equals 2 times vals 2. And it's like, oh, that's fine. It's not a number, but that's okay. We'll put that in the array. But how long is the array now? The array now is length 3. If we do the same thing with 3, let's change this to use vals.length, because that's what's happening in the code. We can run this endlessly, and we never, get to the end of the array, because every time we do it, the array gets 1 element longer. And so that's why this turned into an infinite loop. So always make sure that you only access indexes that exist. This is also one of the reasons I was trying to emphasize this with strings, because JavaScript doesn't go quite as crazy as it can with arrays when you do this. But it can cause problems there, and it can really cause problems with arrays, and it can crash your program and more often in other languages. So only access indexes of your array that already exist. And that's why we need to have this less than here, so we stop at the last index of the array instead of accessing something that doesn't exist. Okay. Create an array of size 5 and fill it with zeros. How should you do this? Well, we talked about how to create an array that's empty. It's, I shouldn't say empty, that has like length 5, but doesn't contain any values yet. And then try to use a for loop to fill it with values. So you're gonna have a loop very similar to this, because as I said, this is your favorite for loop. So give this one a try. All right, let's go through a solution ourselves. Let's just call it a zeros array. Though honestly, this is something you'll often do, even if it's an array that it's because it'll be an array that you expect to have values, but you're going to start off with zeros. You're going to have something like this in the lab or assignment, but you'll see that there. Equals new array 5. Well, now we have an array that has 5 elements, but they're all undefined. So let's define them and give them the value 0. So for let I equal 0, I is less than zeros array.length. You know that the length is 5 here, but I want you to get into the habit of using the dot length I++, and then you just need to say zeros array I equals 0. And we can print that out and see what's in it. So we create the empty array, we put a 0 into every element, and then we're printing it to the page. And there we see 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So when you're working with an array, you're working with a loop. Back to some simpler questions. I encourage you to pause the video and try these, even though they're a little more straightforward than what we were actually just doing. Write an expression that refers to the string Revelstoke within the array. Well, you have an array called resorts. How do we get Revelstoke? What's its index? 0, 1, 2, 3. So it'd be resorts and a 3 in the square brackets. What is the value of the expression resorts.length? 6 elements, so the length is 6. What's the index of the last element, the last item in the array? Well, the length is 6, so the last element has index 5. You really need to know that without thinking. You know, especially if you're going to be a good programmer in time. Of course, right now you're going to have to think a little bit, but hopefully after working with arrays for a few days, for a week or two, you'll start to just remember that instantaneously. You start at 0, you go to the length minus 1. What is the value of the expression resorts 5? Well, that's just the last one, Red Mountain. Write an expression to find the first index of Silver Star within the array. I actually haven't talked about this yet, but this is another commonality between strings and arrays. There's a lot of them. A string is just basically an array of characters. And in some programming languages, a string is literally an array of characters, though JavaScript, I believe, does it a little differently. And so what was the method to search for something in a string? It was index of, and it's the same thing here. You could do resorts.indexOf, and then put in your search string, Silver Star. Let me do a quick example of that in the console. Do I have did I go back way too far? Okay, let vals equals that. Let's add a couple more. Vals.indexOf 3 gives us index 2. Search for something that doesn't exist in the array, and we get -1, which means it was not found. So another function that kind of crosses over between strings and arrays. So again, think of an array as like a collection of variables with related names. The literal variable stores the entire array, but then you can use the square brackets to access the first variable, the second variable, the third variable, so on. You can access them, modify them, do everything you need. Just like when we were accessing indexes of strings, you can use a variable as an index, as I've been doing already with I. If you need to, you might need to do I plus 1, I minus 1, the length minus 1, the length minus I. Just whatever you need can be in there. We're not going to make it too complicated, though depending on what you're trying to do, sometimes you might actually have a fairly complex expression to figure out the index that's needed. Okay. New exercise. Write a function that takes an array of integers as a parameter. Create and return an array that stores 2 numbers, the count of evens and count of odds, in the parameter array. So let's talk about what this is doing. The one parameter is going to store an array of numbers. So you know it's going to have, you can assume that it has good numbers in it. And what this should return is an array with 2 elements. The array you're creating will always have 2 elements. The first one is how many even numbers there are in the parameter. In this case, there's 1. The second value is the count of odds, 1, 2, 3. So inside the function, create the result array. So this array starts out as an array of length 2, storing 2 zeros. You need to loop through the parameter array, updating the result for even and odd values. So look at each of these numbers, and if it's odd, add 1 to the second value of the result. If it's even, add 1 to the first value. There's no prompts, No display, no globals, nothing like that. This all happens locally inside the function. So give this one a try. Okay, let's work through this one together. So let's write a separate function here. Function count evens odds. Let's just call this vals. We need the result array. How do we create a result array storing 2 zeros? Since it's only 2 values, probably easiest to just do this. You could do the new array and then assign the zeros, but this is probably the shortest way in this case. Now we need to write a loop to go through vals. Well, another chance to use our favorite for loop. For let I equals 0, I is less than vals.length, I plus plus. You can see this over and over again, where the only thing that changes is the array name. Be careful, because occasionally we'll need to change it, but you're going to see it a lot. And so what do we want to do now? Well, we want to check the current value. And we don't want to know if it's even or odd. We're going to assume that it's an integer. So let's just say if vals I, access the value at index I. How do we check if it's even? If vals remainder 2 is equal to 0, well, then we want to go to our result and say result index 0, because remember that's the first one. Let me put a comment here to make it easier to remember. That's going to be evens odds. So result 0 equals result 0 plus 1. You could also use plus equals. You could also use plus plus. Those also work with arrays. So it's either going to be even, else we're going to result 1, else we have an odd number, equals result 1 plus 1. Where do we want to return the value? Really common mistake is putting stuff into a loop that doesn't need to be. How many times do we want to return the value? Once. So we need to return it after the loop. If you put return result inside the loop would run once and then end. So always be careful about something. Think, does this need to happen one time or a whole bunch of times? If it needs to happen a whole bunch of times, probably inside the loop. If it needs to happen only once, probably outside the loop. As with most things, there are going to be exceptions, but that's a pretty good starting point, is if it happens once, put it before or after the loop. I'm going to test this in the console instead of changing the run example function. So let's create an array. Numbers equals 2, 3, 2, 2, 4. Sure. And then we could say count evens odds numbers. And we get 4, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4 evens, and 1 odd. So every time when it went through the loop it hit an even number, it increased this value by 1. Every time it hit an odd, it increased this value by 1. There's a solution here. Here you can see it's using the plus plus. So there's a way to make this shorter. So pause the video and think for a minute. Don't take a lot of time, but just see if in 30 seconds or a minute you can think of a way to make this piece of code more compact. Some students are ready to see this already. Most aren't, but I want you to try, because there's kind of a neat thing that you can do here to make this compact if you notice something that's happening. Okay, well, as a hint, if values I remainder 2 is equal to 0, we increment index 0. if values I remainder 2 is, if it's an odd number, we're going to get 1, in which case we increment index 1. And so we can simplify this to say, just increment this index, because if it's even, this becomes 0 and we increment index 0. If this is odd, it's 1 and we increment index 1. So just a neat trick. This is 100% correct, but when you see what's happening, you can take this expression, just put it inside those square brackets, and it comes up with the index that you need. Alright, so let's go through a few more things we can do with arrays. I already talked about this index of a little bit, so move through this quickly, but you can use index of to search for values in the array. If they're not in the array, they will return -1. If you want to copy an array or parts of an array, we're going to have to do something a little bit different. There's a slice method that we can use to get a copy of a piece of an array, and this is similar to the substring method for strings. The slice method returns the selected elements in an array as a new array, so that it's making an actual copy. Slice selects elements starting at the start argument and ends at, but does not include, the given end argument. So this is the exact same as we had with strings. So if we have this fruits array, and we say fruits.slice 1, 3, it starts at index 1, 0, 1, and it ends immediately before index 3. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, so it starts at index 1, includes index 2, but not index 3. So fruits.slice 1, 3 gives you orange, lemon as a new separate array. The original array is unchanged. If you want to copy an entire array, we use .slice with no parameters, and so this just gives you a copy of the whole thing. And in fact, this is how we will copy arrays, using .slice with no values passed in. Just gives you a copy of the entire array. So why are we using slice to copy arrays? Because arrays and objects, when we get to them later, are handled differently than primitive data types. So normally, let's jump to the browser. If we just wanted to copy a value, we could just say like x, let x equals 5, or 5, yeah. And then say let y equals x. Y is now 5, and we can change y. Y is 6, x is still 5. Y was a copy of x. Well, what happens with arrays and objects, basically complex pieces of data, is if we do y equals x, it doesn't make a copy. It makes x and y into two different names for the array. They're actually pointing to the same array in memory. And so if we did y equals x here, and we say y0 equals a, what is y and what is x? Well, they're both going to be the same thing, which is a, 2, 3. So let's try that here. Let's say let x equals 1, 2, 3. Let y equal x. So we look at y, we look at x, seems okay, but if we say y0 equals a, y is now a23, and x is now a23. X and y aren't copies, they're the same array. Why does this happen? There's actually a really straightforward logic for why this is happening. When you say x assign y to x or x to y, and it's just a number, there's one value being copied. That's easy to do. You're not worried about space or time or anything like that. Arrays and objects, when we get to them, can have hundreds or thousands, or in some cases millions of values. And so if you set y equals to x, it's not going to make a copy of the array, because maybe you don't want to make a copy of millions of values. Maybe you just want to have another way to reference it. And that's what's happening here, is you're creating a new reference, a new name for the same array. And so you have to be careful. If you want to make a copy of x, you have to say y equals x dot slice. Now y and x once again start the same, but if I say y1 equals b, getting rid of the dot, now we have y has ab3 and x was not changed. Using dot slice makes an actual copy. Along similar lines is when we use an array as a parameter. Remember when we pass numbers, strings, or booleans as a parameter, the value is copied in, and no matter what do we do to this parameter inside the function, it does not change, a variable that was used to pass in the value. The value is copied to this parameter and then the function runs. With arrays and objects, it's not copied for the same reasons. This becomes a reference to the original array or object. And so you can actually make changes to the original array inside the function. So if we say x equals the array 1, 2, 3, and we call double x, then we're doubling every value in the original array. Do I have this one ready to experiment with? Yes, I do have double ready here, so I can use this in the console. So let's say let x equals 1, 2, 3. I now say double x, and now x has the values 2, 4, 6. It changed the original array. What would happen if instead of double x, I said x equals double x? Let's try it. X equals double x. Undefined. Why is x now undefined? This function doesn't return anything. It doesn't need to. This function is written so that it alters the original array. There's no reason to return it. And so in this case, if we set x equals double x, we're getting undefined, because if a function returns nothing, just like if we assign nothing to a variable, it's actually returning the value undefined, and so we're assigning that to x. Now you might ask, well, what's wrong with at the end of this function writing return numbers array, and then you don't have this problem? It's not a bad error, but it's just kind of pointless. If you understand what the function's doing, then you don't need to have that extra line of code. You can just rely on the fact that if you call double x, it's changing the original array, and you should understand that you don't need to return it. This is something you're going to see in the lab, is the difference between changing a parameter array and creating a new array and returning it. This is an important point, and we will work on that in the lab this week. We can insert elements within the array. Remember, where does push add an element to the array? It always adds it to the end. We can use splice to insert elements into the middle of the array. You can actually use splice to simultaneously remove elements and insert new ones. We're generally going to use it to just either insert elements or remove elements, and not try to do both at the same time. It just gets pretty confusing with everything that you're figuring out. So splice takes 3 parameters, and notice it is splice with an L as opposed with a P as opposed to slice without a P. I know that those two names are so similar it can be easy to confuse them. Splice takes a position, how many elements to remove, and what elements do you want to add. So if we take the array 1, 2, 4, and we do array.splice, we go to index 2, 0, 1, 2. We're not removing anything here, but we want to insert the value 3. This new value will be inserted at index 2, and anything at index 2 and after will get pushed 1 to the right. And so 4 gets pushed to the next index, and we get 3 inserted there. And so this is how we insert something. Give it the index you want to insert it at, put a 0 here, we're not removing anything, and then the value that you want to insert. You can actually have multiple elements here to add, but you're not going to need to do that. Now let's use this to remove an item. Let's just remove one instead of trying to add and remove at the same time. If we have this array, and just keep in mind for these examples, it's hard to have good names, but you generally shouldn't have variables called AR or ARR or array. Give them a descriptive name depending on the situation. Sorry. Well, let's get back to this. Let's say we have our array and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we want to remove an element, we can say ar.splice index 3, and we want to remove one element. So 0, 1, 2, 3. That's going to remove the value 4, and because we have a 1 here, it'll only remove that one value. Notice that this is changing this array. It's not getting returned. We're not assigning it back to AR like we have to do with strings. And so this removes the value 4. The value 4 does get returned. And then our array now has 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. So to remind you again, splice to insert an element. What index do you want to insert it? A 0, and then the element to insert. To remove an element, splice the index where you want to remove the element, and a 1. Remember, you can only pop from the end of the array. You cannot pop from the middle of the array. You have to use splice for the middle. If we want to combine arrays, we can use concatenation, and it's just one array dot concat. You give it the second array, and this will create a single array. I'll do this in the slides. I should have the I thought I used to have the result here. This will create a single array with all the values from both of them. In this case, heroes would be first and the villains would be second. Let's do this quickly in the console. Let's say x equals 1, 2, 3, y equals a, b, c. These should be strings. And then I can say x dot concat y. Notice that this doesn't change x or y. It's creating a new array with copies of the values. Okay, here's a couple array exercises to try with regular arrays, 1D arrays. We're about to talk about 2D arrays. Write a function called oddArrayN that accepts the size of an array as input. This function should then return an array filled with the first n odd numbers. So if this is oddArray 5, it should have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 in the array that's returned. So the first 5 odd numbers. Second one, write a function that takes an array as a parameter and inserts the word no after any yes that's in the array. Don't worry so much about uppercase and lowercase. I think just make it work. If you want to, just make it work with all lowercase. And so if the parameter array was yes, maybe, yes, it should be changed. And so we're changing the parameter array and inserting no's after each yes and become yes, no, maybe, yes, no. And so find the yes, find each yes, and insert a no afterwards. Okay, give those a try. I think I'm going to go through these solutions in the pre-lab video, so look for the solutions there. All right, our final topic for arrays is 2D arrays. So far we've been using kind of a single array where we just have one row of values, but you can put arrays inside of arrays and create a 2D array. And so it's just an array with arrays as its elements. So let's create a small 2D array here. Let my array equals new array 2. And we're going to make the first element of this an array of fruits, apple, orange, banana, pear. And my array 1 equals pink, purple, blue, teal, some colors. And so in this case, we get the result down here where my array refers to the whole thing. My array index 0 refers to this whole inner array. This is an array inside of an array. Remember that I said that each element of an array could be of any type. It can also be another array. My array index 1 will go down to this array. And we're going to have to use 2 indexes to access specific elements. We'll see that in a moment. One comment here is just that we always kind of look at it this way, where the first index represents rows and the second index is always used to represent columns. There's no strict reason why that is done. That is basically just the convention, and I think you'll pretty much always see that followed in examples in computer science. So let's look at how we go further into this. So if we want to access elements, we have to use 2 sets of brackets. If we use 1 set of brackets, that gets us to the first element of the whole thing, which is itself an array. If we want to go to one of the values inside that array, then we have to use another pair of square brackets. Notice that these are one after each other, one after another, not inside each other. And so we have one set of square brackets 0, and then another set of square brackets with the column, the second index. So 0, 0, go to the first inner array, index 0, go to element 0 of it, and we get apple. Index 1, second index 1 gives us purple. So what is stored at my array 0, 3? Well, we go to index 0, index 3, we have pear. What about my array 1, 2? Well, we have index 1, we go over to index 2, and we have blue. So how would you write a function that takes a 2D array as a parameter and returns the sum of all values in the array? It should work for any size 2D array, but you can assume that all of the inner arrays have the same length. So how would you sum, say, all of these numbers, but no matter how many rows and columns there are? And so what you need to do is you're going to need to have a loop going through each row. So you have an outer loop that goes through the length of the entire thing, and then you're going to have an inner loop working through every value in each inner array. So the outer loop uses the length of the whole thing, the number of rows. The inner loop will use the length of these inner arrays. But they're still going to be our favorite loop, just applied in slightly different ways. So give this one a try. Okay, let's go ahead and write this one and try it out. So let's just call this function sum. Typing well would be good. Sum 2D array. And let's just call this nums. And so let me put kind of an example array here. So we might have 1, 2, 3, comma, 4, 5, 6, comma, 7, 8, 9. Just use the same example from the slides. So we need an outer loop that's going to go through each row. So let's just try and write that. We're doing a sum, so let sum equal 0 to start out with. So for let I equal 0, I is less than nums.length, I plus plus. Okay. Instead of trying to write the whole inner loop, let's make sure the outer loop is doing what we want. In this case, hitting each row of this. So let's just do this and say console.log and nums index I, because that's going to be a whole row of numbers. If I is 0, we would get the first row. I is 1, we'd get the second row, and so on. So let's go here. Let's build up a 2D array. 2D nums equal 2, 4, 6, 3, 4, 5, 1, 1, 1. And what did I mess up? Probably messed up a comma or a bracket or something. Uncut syntax error, identifier starts. Oh, I don't think I'm allowed to start a variable name with a number. There we go. Simpler than I thought. So there we have all the values in our array. You can see that with a 2D array, it kind of shows you everything here, but you kind of have to open it up to see more. And now we can see that the outer array has 3 arrays inside of it. Once we have this array, now we can try our function. And I've already forgot, I think it's sum 2D array, there we go. Nums 2D. All right. I was not, so let's see what went wrong. I wasn't expecting a return value, but I was expecting something to print out. So sum 2D array nums, let I equal 0, I is less than nums dot, length would help. I do have use strict at the top. This is just one of those times where you scream at JavaScript and the browser for not pointing out to you that that was typed badly. Let's try this again. If you have ever yelled at JavaScript, believe me, I have yelled at it more times than you will probably ever yell at it. Anyways, here we go. When you console.log the array, you actually get this whole thing where you can expand it and see more. But we are looping through the outer array and printing out the first row, the second row, the third row. The first inner array, the second inner array, the third inner array. So we're getting that outer loop successful. It's hitting each row, each inner array of the whole thing. Just to kind of emphasize that point, if we do nums 2D, we get the whole thing. If we do nums 2D 0, we get that array, the inner array, and then if we want to access something there, we add the second index. So now let's sum up the inner arrays. Now we need a new loop for let j equals 0, our favorite loop again. J is less than, so what do we put here? We want to know the length of the inner array. Well, how do we access the inner array? The inner array is just nums I. That gives us an array, so we can do nums I dot length. Since this gives us an array, we can use dot length or any other of those array methods. J++. What are we doing in here? We're just adding on to our sum. Sum plus equals nums I j. Return sum. And that's it. The outer loop goes over the rows. The inner loop goes over each value in each row. Let's get back to the declaration. Try our function, sum 2D arrays, nums 2D, and we can see that it's adding up to 27. So basically, you know, when we're working with 2D arrays, we're not going to do anything too complicated. We're going to have another example here shortly, but we're often going to have a loop to go through the rows. And depending on what's stored in them, in this case, we need to do a loop for each inner array to get every value. Or if we know exactly where there's, like, say we need to access index 0 of every inner array, we might do that. And we're going to see an example like that next. So here I use the variable names row and column for the loops to kind of emphasize how they're being used, but it's the same idea. I see that this slide has a typo. That should be what? That I should be row. I will try to remember to fix that before I post the slides. Okay, final exercise. Write the JavaScript to create a 2D array. This array should store the following names and midterm exam grades for each of the following students. So we have these names, we have these numbers, and then use a for loop to calculate the average of the midterm exam grades stored in the array. And assume you don't know the length of this. You know, right now we have 5 students, but your loop should work whether it has 2 students or 100 students. But inside this array, there's actually 2 ways to kind of organize this, so I don't want to push you in either direction, but you will have all the names and all the numbers. So give this one a try. Okay, for this one, I don't think I'm going to type out all the code. Let's just kind of look through some solutions. And there's 2 basic ways to do this. Here's the first one. We can create a grade array, and then inside that we can add smaller inner arrays that have one name and their score. And so we can do a bunch of pushes, pushing in Jill 100, Jack 92, all the way down the line. Oh, sorry about that typo. I was just fixing this up and I managed to screw something up. But I also just learned that I can do that and it updates immediately. Isn't that amazing? Whee! Can you tell that I'm a little tired when I'm recording this? Anyhow, so here, we're creating the empty array, and then we're adding in these inner arrays that each have 2 values. And so we have Jill 100 on down the line. So we've created our 2D array. Now we want to loop through and figure out the total so we can do the average. And so we have the regular favorite loop to go through each row, but once we're inside, we only need to access this one value. And so we can say total plus equals grade array I, which is going over each row, and then index 1 from each row gives us the value. And so that's going to create the total for us. And then we just do the average using the length. Let's look at this in the code. I want to put okay, I do have the return statement. Well, we can see here that we have rebuild up the array. I'm showing the array in the console. We calculate the average. I guess I can console.log the average just to show that it is being calculated. But here you'll see how table kind of works nicely. Let's refresh, click our button, and see we get the whole table here. We can see that we have the rows index here. We used I for this. Here we have the columns. 0 has the names. 1 has the numbers. And so we're going through every row index and adding up the value at index 1 to the total so that we can calculate the average. Don't worry about the unreachable code warnings. That's because I put a return in the middle of the method, in the middle of the function. Let's look at the other way to organize this. The other way is like this. And here we have grade array, and it's going to have 2 inner arrays. And we're pushing the names onto the first inner array, and we're pushing the grades onto the second inner array. Once we've done that, we need a loop to go over not all the rows, because there's only 2 rows, but all of the values in this second inner array. So now we're going let I equals 0, I is less than grade array 1, which is this array, dot length. And then for this, we just go through I goes from 0 to the length of this array. So now we have grade array 1, and then at index I within that to get all the numbers. And then we do the same thing. So let's get rid of this return statement, because I have that code down here. And we're also going to want to do console.table, the grade array, and then we'll do the average again, console.log average. And so we'll see both kind of versions of this, one after the other. So we got the same value, 84.4, 84.4. We're just organizing the information differently. Here, each row represents a student. Here, each row represents like one of the pieces of data, name, grade. Which of these is better? Which do you think is better? Well, I think you could find people who argue both ways, but in my opinion, with something like this, they're both completely acceptable. I can think of situations where this would be better. I can think of situations where this might be better. So it just kind of depends on what you're doing. And for the level of what we're doing in this course, you know, if you were kind of coming up with the code, you could do whichever you are more comfortable with. You just have to make sure that you're doing your indexes correctly once you've created the whole 2D array to make sure you're accessing the correct values. That's all I have for today. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next video.